Hello and welcome to the 7th of 8 lectures in the series Shifting Paradigms, Martin Luther's Enduring Global Impact. This series is produced by Martin Luther University College in Waterloo, Ontario, Canada, in cooperation with Third Age Learning KW. These lectures were presented at Rim Park in Waterloo between January 9th and February 27th, 2020. This lecture, Martin Luther and Anti-Semitism, is delivered by Dr. Daniel Maoz, Professor of Hebrew Scriptures and Jewish Scholar in Residence at Martin Luther University College.
So it's a privilege to be here, and I have to admit that I've spoken with all of the speakers who have presented up until today, and including Chris Lund last week. They all have expressed particular enjoyment in preparing and a particular satisfaction in sharing the information that they gained in their presentations with you. I have to admit that I cannot agree with them when it comes to talking about Martin Luther's anti-Semitism. I have not enjoyed the larger part of what I'm going to share with you, and were I to have done the research and then asked, would you like to give a presentation on that, I would have flatly said, no, thank you. However, Alan Jorgensen encouraged me to let you know that even though the first hour is going, and up until the break, is going to cover some very ugly aspects of history and some very unfortunate, and that's a kind assessment, unfortunate portraits of Martin Luther, after the break, I will look at statements, declarations, various conferences that have been held by the Lutheran Church globally, nationally, and locally, all of which will bring us to a very positive conclusion this afternoon. But I'll ask you to bear with me as I bear with myself as we go through the various aspects of Martin Luther and anti-Semitism. I'd like to begin just with a very quick survey of self-disclosure, because there are a number of things about my academic and personal life that particularly inform me, and therefore also inform biases that you will hear from me. After which, I would like to frame the context of Martin Luther. Martin Luther, as we know from the various presentations in the past, came from a Catholic context and was in fact a Catholic priest, and there was already an insipid anti-Semitism in the Catholic mindset before Martin Luther came along. So I'd like to quickly look at that, and then I would like to then spend a bit of time, quite a bit of time, looking at Jewish thought that Martin Luther could not abide by, that the Catholic Church could not abide by. Jewish thought and particular aspects of Jewish thought that are always part of Jewish tradition and are unchangeable parts of Jewish tradition that have to do with the differences between the Christian message and the Jewish message with respect to God and community. Next, I would like to look at, and I put it in quotation marks because I'll actually disagree with myself on using the word ambivalence, but I'll begin to call it Luther's initial ambivalence to anti-Semitism. That is, in his coming out of that Catholic context and opposing certain aspects of that Catholic context that in effect created a Reformation, he did not address the anti-Semitism of the church at that time. And whether it's ambivalence or not, whether he is philo-Judaic or not, we will talk about that a little bit in passing. And then we'll have a break, and that's pretty much the end of the negativity right there. And then we'll all have a bite to eat, we'll increase our blood sugar levels, and we'll come back and we'll have a positive closure in which we'll look at Martin Luther's contribution to anti-Semitism. Now, it starts out negative, of course, but it will then culminate in these very positive statements of addressing the anti-Semitism that is, or that had been, central to various Christian messages. And in conclusion, I'd like to look at the three categories that the Brookline Institute has created to talk about the results of anti-Semitism with respect to the perpetrators, the bystanders, and the victims. And then we have pages and pages of sources that I have drawn from, which we'll just scroll while we're looking at questions that you have for me. So let's begin with some self-disclosure, but I want to peel it back. I want to start more recent and peel back to a day gone by. I had a bar mitzvah at the Western Wall called the Kotel in Jerusalem in 1998. It was at that time that I changed my name because there was something in Jewish tradition that says that if you change your name, you change your destiny. And in fact, in a prayer book, in pretty much any weekly prayer book and Sabbath prayer book in Judaism's religious expressions, whether they're Orthodox or Reform or Conservative or Reconstructionist or what, there is a page or two in Hebrew and in English translation where there's a formulaic prayer for changing your name. And the understanding is, if you are living in your life and you have, for example, an illness, and it's chronic, then you might change your name to something that sounds like the Hebrew word for healing or healed, Raphael, Raphi. And in changing your name and in owning that new name, Jewish tradition teaches that you are seeing yourself in a healthy way. You are actually nudging your destiny toward health rather than the disadvantage of illness. So at my bar mitzvah in the Kotel, I renamed Daniel Maoz. Daniel Maoz, therefore, I can say to each one of you, was never born. And because Daniel Maoz was never born, the person whose birth name I was born with will never die. And then I remember a judge one time saying to me in a court of law, "But you are the same person, aren't you?" And I said, "Yes, I am." And he said, "Well, then we may proceed." The idea of changing my name came only after I discovered that my mother was born to Jewish parents. So my grandparents on my mother's side are Jewish, though my mother was raised not Jewish, and her siblings and she were not told that Grandpa and Grandma were Jewish. So I was the first to discover this, and as a result, I had already been teaching Bible in a Christian context, and I had a student in one of my Christian courses on anti-Semitism ask, "What would happen if you found out you were Jewish?" And I don't know why they asked that. I'm sure they don't know why they asked that, except that I always had a strong Jewish emphasis in my teachings, and it was a course on anti-Semitism. And I said, I think if I found out I was Jewish, A, I would be honored, and B, unlike two brothers in the Hebrew narratives, I would not sell my birthright for a bowl of porridge. And when I found out that my mother was Jewish and therefore I'm Jewish, it occurred to me, this doesn't have to change my life. And then those words that I gave to that student came back to me. So having said that, what I talk about next in peeling back the layers will make more sense, because anything before this is me not knowing that I'm Jewish. In 1996-97, Laura, my wife, and I took a sabbatical at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And it was at Hebrew University in Jerusalem that I actually did the research to find out at the genealogy center that my parents were, my mother rather, was Jewish. My father is not Jewish, but according to Jewish tradition, it's the mother that counts, not the father. And part of the reason, of course, the question that always comes up is, well, then why in the Hebrew Scriptures is the father always named and the mothers aren't? And the smart answer, wisecrack answer, but also the real answer is you always know who the mother is. So you got to name the father. It was during that sabbatical year at Hebrew University that I worked on a manuscript, and my first publication came out looking at the Sermon on the Mount and rabbinic literature. And so you see my birth name here. Stoutenberg is a Dutch name, and when I found out that I was Jewish, I asked the shaliach, or the emissary from Israel to Manitoba and Saskatchewan, where we were living, what is Stoutenberg in Hebrew? Because Stoughton is strong, fortified, and Berg, of course, is an inhabited village. So he said, Maoz. God is Maoz. In the Psalms, we flee to God as Maoz, as this fortified stronghold in times of trouble. And so that was how I managed to use the name Maoz. In this study, I took every verse of the Sermon on the Mount, the ethical teachings of Matthew chapters 5, 6, and 7, and investigated parallel thought and phraseology that is found in all of rabbinic literature, particularly in the Talmud and in Midrash. And Doug mentioned earlier Agadic Midrash, which is the ethical Midrash of Jewish text. Prior to that, my first academic journal was published on the New Testament story of Jesus telling Peter, "Get behind me, Satan." Never sat well with me. Jesus saying to anyone, a human being in particular, Satan. So I did an investigation, and I found out that, I'll read it here, the Talmud affirms the literal sense in which disciples follow their masters. One account describes Gamaliel as preceded by his slave, but followed by his disciple. Rabbi Eli, en route from Akko to Kasib. Midrash examples abound with support of the same principle. So what we understand from that is when Jesus said, "Get behind me," he meant literally. Because anyone standing in front of him would, as he said, become a stumbling stone for him that he would trip over. So it was the rabbinic expression of get in a position of discipleship, not in a position of opposition or where I would stumble. And so, of course, it goes on and looks at all the different expressions within that context, and then follows through, as you know, if you know this particular text in the New Testament, if anyone would come after me, if anyone would come after me, if anyone would get into a position of discipleship, and you know, they must first take up the cross and follow me. Deny self, take up the cross, and follow me. So that's the formula. And that's the formula for rabbinic discipleship as well. And that was my first publication, also before I found out that I was Jewish. I did my doctorate in Strasbourg, as was mentioned, Strasbourg, France. And at the University of Strasbourg, I wrote my dissertation on the Greek of the New Testament. The Greek of the New Testament is a particular phase of the Greek language, and it was important to me to find out how it differed from classical Greek prior to it and its various dialects, and how it differed from modern Greek, as we still have today. And Greek being the language that has changed the least of all the ancient languages that still are extant today or exist today. And prior to that, and this is where it all comes into focus for us today, I I did my master's in the history of Christianity in Chicagoland, and I wrote a thesis and defended it publicly on Martin Luther's exegetical use of the Epistle of St. James toward an understanding of Luther's viewpoint of, quote-unquote, the Epistle of Straw. And I corresponded with Roland Bainton at the time, who was just finished writing Here I Stand, A Life of Martin Luther. And Roland Bainton and I had a wonderful time. I think I was the kid in the candy store corresponding with this man. But he was very generous of spirit and of time in helping me think through a number of the aspects that I was finding that certainly ran counter to typical Lutheran interpretation of Luther's view of the book of James. And in that, I took 3 years off, and some friends of mine, a doctor and lawyer married couple, gave me Luther's works. So I took 3 years off and I read them 3 times, and was paralyzed because Luther said so much. And a lot of what he said helped me contextualize just about everything I'd ever heard about Martin Luther. And so I felt a little more prepared to write a master's thesis on Luther's view, not of Scripture in toto, but rather just took one particular aspect of it. And just to give you a little idea, Martin Luther depended on Erasmus's critical edition of the New Testament before he translated his 1520 translation in modern German, and therefore Erasmus excluded the 4 books, the Antilegomena, which included the book of Hebrews. And so it wasn't until the 1522 edition, the second edition of his translation, that he actually had time to find the text of those 4 books and translate them into German and put them back in order. So I think that it's more a critique of Erasmus that the book of James was excluded and questioned rather than of Luther, but you can read my thesis on that. And then finally, I married a Lutheran. There's no apologies necessary. She's not here. But I married not just a Lutheran from a family of Lutheran pastors, but her first cousin is the national bishop of the Lutheran Church of Canada. So I married right into the center of the bee's nest, right next to the queen bee. And so I have had a wonderful Jewish Lutheran engagement ever since I found out I was Jewish, and my wife decided she wasn't going to keep changing her name every time I changed mine. So those are pretty much the disclosures, except I want to say that I am currently Jewish Scholar in Residence at Martin Luther University College and Professor of Hebrew Scriptures there, and I couldn't have fallen into a better place at a better time. And I will unpack that as we get to the second part of the presentation. Well, let's move into the difficult stage of this presentation, the part that I don't want to be here about. But here I am, and I think I do feel privileged and honored to go over this history with you, and I welcome your questions and your comments after the second part. As strange as it may seem, Mark Harris began in our very first session, and I was sitting right over here at the time just before allergies took over. The place to begin is almost 2 centuries before Luther's birth, when the Black Death, a form of bubonic plague, swept through Eurasia. The plague was one of the most devastating pandemics in human history. Mark Harris started there, and even though in reconstructing Catholic anti-Semitism I could go much earlier, I chose that to be an equally relevant place for us to begin to address Lutheran anti-Semitism, as it sets the stage for the world that Luther inherited in terms of views and treatments of Jews from the religious setting of his day. The Christian world before Martin Luther was of two founding Christian traditions. In Constantinople in the east and in Rome in the west, we see that the Orthodox Church, of which the Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, and many branches of this Orthodox tradition arose, and separately the Church in Rome, which came to be known as the Roman Catholic tradition. And because Luther really didn't have influence and upbringing in the Orthodox Church, though it has its own anti-Semitism that we could talk about, I am particularly interested in focusing only on the anti-Semitism of the Catholic world in which Martin Luther grew up. So one of the first things that Mark Harris introduced it to, and I won't repeat what he said, was that the Black Plague brought the world to its knees. One of the things that is very bothersome about the Black Plague from a Jewish point of view is that springing up in various communities and in various countries where the Black Plague was decimating the population, Jews were blamed. Jews have purity laws. We have ablutions, we have various rituals for washing our hands at various stages of the day, and we tend to be healthier as a result of it. When the Jewish population was identified in some areas as not getting as much effect by the plague as other parts of the population that weren't Jewish, there was suspicion. Also, adding to the anti-Semitism that was already there, Jews had already been an easy scapegoating target, and for various and sundry reasons, Jews were not only blamed but persecuted for, quote-unquote, starting the Black Plague. The Pope at the time, and the subsequent Pope, while the plague was continuing in its various centuries, 2.5, I believe, popes distributed statements saying that the Jews were not to blame for the plague. However, it didn't really have a positive effect on the Jewish community because once the stereotype was out there and once the blame was given, the people were not listening to these edicts from the papal sources. So we have then the Black Plague as being one of the realities of Catholic anti-Semitism. A second reality was that the Catholic Church wanted Jews to be baptized and converted to Catholicism or Christianity, and therefore they would obligate Jewish communities to convert at the point of death. And we have many examples from many different city-states and countries of this. It was again an element of anti-Semitism that Martin Luther was birthed in and grew up in and represented as a Catholic monk. We have many expulsions, and I'll go over a list of some of the expulsions in a few minutes, but the expulsions were seen as an act of kindness and an act of grace to the Jewish community. We won't kill you, we'll just tell you to get out of town. And many conversations I've had with a number of different non-Lutheran leaders in Christianity have told me that Christianity, from their point of view, is kinder than the Lutheran tradition because they never got to the point of killing Jews. And maybe from a non-Jewish point of view, that's good news. But from a Jewish point of view, it's just like, would you like to be killed, or would you just like to be flogged? Would you like to be shunned, or would you like to be completely expelled? And so the history of Catholic anti-Semitism, when it didn't force conversion at point of death, engaged in expulsion whole communities, 6,000 Jewish people in one town, for example. And I don't mean to be anecdotal in giving singular examples, because there are atlases of Jewish history that show maps of the expulsions, and several different maps covering the stages of expulsions at this time. And again, as I mentioned, we'll look at some of the specifics in a few minutes. The host desecration is an interesting charge against Jews, because it was oddly ascribed to Jews that they were taking the Eucharist elements, the bread and the wine, and they were desecrating it so that when Christians celebrated the Eucharist, they were actually celebrating with desecrated symbols. Why Jews would have desecrated the host to start with, and then how they would have been able to do that, was never addressed in these particular charges. Again, they were uncritically carried out to the persecution and the expulsion. But again, these are just categories of anti-Semitism that were evident and widespread within the Catholic world as Luther was birthed into it. And finally, the blood libel. The blood libel is a charge in which during Passover, Jews take the blood of young Christian children and integrate it into their Passover service or Seder meal. And there are a number of levels at which this could not be true, and we'll talk about one of them in particular, the most significant of them, when we talk about Jewish thought, and in particular the elements of the Eucharist and how non-Jewish the teaching of that is. So the bottom line then here is that Martin Luther was not the inventor of anti-Semitism, and he certainly did not create anything new in terms of the charges against Jews that would be at a religious level anti-Jewish, and at a people group level anti-Semitic. And I probably should also mention that the terminology of anti-Judaism is not ancient terminology. It's not medieval terminology, it's not Renaissance, it's not Reformation terminology. It's terminology. Anti-Judaism is a term that was invented and popularized in the early 17th century, mid-17th century, and anti-Semitism didn't even get currency as a terminology until the mid to late 1800s, and it was actually a term that was invented by a German who wanted to find a way to talk about persecution of Jews and marginalization of Jews in such a way that it would be acceptable. So even when I'm using the language of anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism, there is serious question among historical critics and historians that this is anachronistic terminology, and I recognize that. We're working on terminology right now in a number of research projects, and it's probably better to call it racism, and religion-based racism if it's anti-Judaism, and people-specific racism if it's anti-Semitism, but the terminology hasn't settled yet, so I stay with the standard language, recognizing the flaw in it. So turning to Jewish thought, think it's important to know that there are reasons why Jewish thought does not satisfy Christian theology. And if it were a matter of identifying some of the most pivotal, foundational points within Jewish thought that are contrary to, as well as challenging to Christian theology, that would be one thing, and that would be a discussion, and that we could have an interfaith dialogue on that. But if the mindset is that Jewish thought is outmoded and Christian thought is the new revelation from God superseding Jewish revelation, then we're into the same mindset as we hear with Islam saying that the revelation to Muhammad has superseded the revelation to Jesus or through Jesus and the revelation to Moses at Sinai. Or another way of looking at it would be if, for example, God spoke through some various documentation that superseded the Christian documentation of the New Testament, then it would be an upgrading of that and perhaps an entirely novel branch of Christianity would recognize that new revelation at the exclusion of the other revelation. So, for example, I know that one branch of the Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints holds to that position. And so we have various examples of this, and somehow we manage to live together. With Jews and Judaism, however, the starting point for me has to be the term Torah. The first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible are exactly the first 5 books of the Christian Bible. The Christian Bible has the Latin terminology of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, and the 5 books of Moses in the Hebrew Bible are simply the Hebrew words, either the first word or the first key word in each of those 5 books, starting with Bereshit, or in beginning, and ending up with Devarim, which these are the words, the very first words of Deuteronomy. The Torah itself, anybody who has taken the time to read these 5 books, whether in the Christian Bible or in a translation of the Hebrew Bible, understands that there are significant amounts of legal writing, the do's and the don'ts, the thou shalts and the thou shalt nots. But largely, these 5 books are narratival. They tell stories. They start out with 2 poems about creation. They continue on with a poem about flood. They continue on with another poem about how languages are divided up. And that's the poetry of the 5 books of Moses, or the Torah. After that, we get stories of patriarchs and matriarchs, and all the way up to and including moving geographically throughout that part of the world, and stories of being in Egypt, stories of being in Canaan, largely narratival, with these legal code sections included. So to translate Torah as law is not something that Judaism does. And Judaism even reads the legislation within these texts as instructional. Do this and live. So to hear the same text that traditionally we understand as instruction from Sinai as to how to live well, translated into law, and law that has been surpassed by something else, is not Jewish thought. The fourth gospel has a prologue in the New Testament that makes a summary statement. The law came through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. Now, from a Jewish mindset, we might have no interest whatever and wish you well with the second part, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ, but we would hear in the first part, yes, maybe not law, but instruction. Torah came through Moses. However, if we were to read it, we would not put but between those two parts. And the Greek doesn't. We would put and. So that if you're looking at the revelatory message of God to the Hebrew people, Torah came through Moses. Where? At Sinai. And what about for the rest of the world? Well, Sinai, according to Judaism, is not for everybody. It's just a call for the Jewish people. And so if grace and truth came through Jesus Christ, nothing wrong with that from a Jewish perspective. Good. But it's not excluding. It's simply making a statement that is different from what the statement is about Jews and Judaism. And a reinforcement of that might be if we continued to read the Gospels and we would hear that when Simeon lifted the baby Jesus and said, I can die now, this is a light of revelation to my people Israel. This is a light of revelation to the nations, and to my people Israel a glory. And we would hear, oh, okay, so if Jesus is going to be a glory for the people of Israel, we certainly haven't felt that over the last 2 years, but if Jesus has a glory imposed effect on Jews, then that would align with the law Torah came through Moses. And grace and truth for everybody else could be, none of our business, could be through Jesus Christ. So there are various ways of reading it, but not to the exclusion of Jewish thought and reception of revelation at Sinai. And I start with that because I think if we left it there, then we wouldn't have any of the subsequent challenges that we had throughout history with anti-Semitism of Jews not converting to Christianity. Having said that, Stuart Rosenberg wrote a book in 1987 called The Christian Problem. And I know it's a take on the anti-Semitic trope of the Jewish problem that took place particularly prior to and during the Holocaust. But Stuart Rosenberg talks about, in fact, the publisher's blurb says, this is a hard-hitting, no-holds-barred study of anti-Semitism, which the rabbi author contends is a Christian problem because of the triumphalism of the Christian church and the negative, distorted view of Jews and Judaism found in much of their theology and writings at that time. Now, Rosenberg could easily, and I would certainly be among those who would criticize Rosenberg as using stereotypes of Christianity, just as Christianity has been in many cases charged with using untrue stereotypes of Jews and Judaism. Having said that, he turns it on its head and he reminds us that what culminates in the anti-Semitism that has raised the bar of necessity to address whatever it is that is feeding this fire post-Holocaust can all be traced back to the supersessionist views, the obligation on the part of Christian missions to go into all the world and convert Jews. Though from a Jewish thought perspective, we have our path of revelation too. Interfaith discussions would acknowledge the same God. One other thing about Jewish thought, maybe we'll get right into that here now. Christian theology, now we may quibble over details as Jews, and Jews may quibble over various statements and details about the Christian Testament, which Alan Jorgensen refers to as the Jesus Testament or the Second Testament, such as the Jewish expectation of a messianic figure appearing on the scene. When we look at Jewish thought tells us that there were among some Jews in the Second Temple period when the New Testament was being lived out and the stories were told and written down sometime later, there was an expectation among some that there would be a messianic figure appear on the scene. However, it would be from a text such as Zechariah 14, either verses 7 to 9 or 16 to 19, that talk about this and give this expectation. And that expectation is set in the context of the Feast of Booths or the Feast of Tabernacles, not during Passover. So when we see the triumphal entry of Jesus at Passover, a Jewish reader would not be surprised if the crowds of Jewish people who are witnessing this and who are thinking, maybe this is the Messiah or this is the Messiah, take out the fronds of palms and take out the leaves of willows and toss them in the street and sing Hoshia-na, save us, all symbols of and talked about in Zechariah as what you do when Messiah comes, that particular interpretation of that text at least, what you do and what you say during the Feast of Tabernacles. So we're getting a Tabernacles phenomenology taking place out of time during Passover. But it works if your expectation is this is the one that Zechariah is talking about, and therefore, no matter what our calendar says, we're going to do what Zechariah says we should do. Get another hint of that on the Mount of Transfiguration when Jesus ascends to the Mount of Transfiguration with three of his disciples, Jacob, Peter, and John. Jacob gets renamed James in honor of King James in the 1611 translation. Prior to that, he's always Jacob. Anyway, that aside, Jacob, Peter, and John are up there on Mount of Transfiguration, and they see Jesus transfigured. He's white. He's gloriously white. And Peter comes up with the idea, maybe this is that which Zechariah is talking about. So let me build 3 booths. Let me build 3 tabernacles. It's not the calendar, but I know what I'm supposed to do if I believe this is the Messiah. So let me practice tabernacles. Now, you might question, why would they be so open to running contrary to their own calendar? The Dead Sea Scrolls and Josephus and other early literature identify at least 6 calendars, none of which were the same as the other, all vying for predominance and basically a standardization in the late Second Temple period. So already they're aware that maybe our calendars are a little bit off. The intercalation of the calendars in order to work with the solar calendar, the Julian calendar, didn't take place until the 2nd and 3rd centuries and finalized in Judaism. So there was always that question. So there shouldn't be as much of a concern of saying maybe this is tabernacles instead of Passover, that is the triumphal entry, or up on Mount of Transfiguration, let me build 3 booths, let me build 3 tabernacles, Peter, when in fact it was not the time of the Feast of Tabernacles. In any event, we have to work these things out, and literal interpretation of Scripture is also not a big Jewish thing, so we would have a little more flexibility on that matter. Jewish thought, different than Christian theology, in that Theophrastus, the 3rd century before the Common Era philosopher, admitted that in his writings, the Jews were not so much a community of religious people, but they were a community of philosophers. And so in recognizing that, throughout history, the rabbis have been very careful to include those who philosophically aligned with Judaism, but didn't necessarily religiously align. We will eventually understand if we keep on the path. So the rabbis are less interested in everyone in their congregation believing. And that, of course, invites to anyone who wants to be a judge, je suis pas le contrôleur, I used to say in France. But if you wanted to be somebody who was in control of someone else, and particularly their religious views that may not align with your understanding of their religion, then here would be an opportunity to say, it's a religion of works, not of faith. That works against the whole idea that the Torah is received as instruction. It's not received as a path to eternal life. It's received as a path of do this and live in the here and now. Now, the rabbis would argue historically, and Maimonides in particular, if you look after the here and now properly, the hereafter will look after itself. So it never was a major concern from a rabbinic thought point of view as to whether or not the religious aspects lined up. Go and study was always the last 3 words that rabbis would give on any topic. Because we can only, even in a session like this, we can only spend an hour and a half of me sharing information and another, 3 or 4 hours of your questions with me afterwards. And that is so little compared to the centuries and the millennia of conversation that is there for us to access. So Jewish thought and Christian theology. When you pick up a book and it's called Jewish Theology, that's accommodated language. Within the family, there isn't Jewish theology. Theology is a Christian term based on, of course, the Greek way of thinking and way of dividing up aspects and topics. So Jewish thought then is much more permissive. And it doesn't exclude faith, but it doesn't obligate faith. Original sin versus imperfect humanity. Original sin is a Christian belief based on the Apostle Paul's statement, therefore, just as sin entered into the world through one person and death through sin, and so death spread to all humanity because all sinned, Romans 5:12. And we know that. The doctrine was fully developed by the church father Augustine of Hippo, 4th century to mid-5th century, 354 to 430. For Jews, however, whether humans have imperfections or whether humans admit to their imperfections is different than having original sin. The idea, for example, that, let me just catch up to my notes here, whether humans are sinners by nature or not is actually immaterial to Jews and traditional Judaism. Judaism teaches that the biblical way to repentance and reconciliation with God is sincere repentance in which the sinner pledges to rectify their sinful ways and lead a life that is prescribed as righteous and one that is open at all times. So it's not important to Judaism that a person is born as a sinner and remains as a sinner. It's important that tshuva, or turning, is always known to be an option. So if I'm walking in this direction and walking for God is that direction, tshuva doesn't mean 90-degree turn, though it does mean turn. It just means finding some aspect of my life and turning a bit. And after tshuv, after turning and turning and turning, we find ourselves approximating, but never arriving at a perfect life, because we're imperfect beings. So Judaism factors in the idea that if we are to be perfect as God is perfect, such as the Hebrew Scriptures do tell us, it doesn't mean we have to be without flaw. It simply means we have to keep improving. We have to keep committing ourselves to self-betterment, which is all and only what Jewish ethics is all about. And that, therefore, precludes the idea of an original sin in which someone failed or someone's failed, and therefore thereafter everyone begins with failure. For Jews, and the rabbinic message to Jews is when you wake up in the morning, you have a fresh start. What from yesterday's brokenness you return to, that's your business. But today is a fresh start. And each day is a new opportunity to walk a little bit more in turning toward the way that we all know, or that we can learn, is the way to walk, do this, and live. So, going back to the idea of original sin, which is not Jewish at all, and instead thinking about the imperfection of every human being in any generation, we look at a thought and a teaching of the church. And now this is the Catholic Church that Martin Luther would have come out of and actually raised some questions about. One of his favorite lines repeatedly throughout these volumes and volumes and volumes of Luther's works that I read was every once in a while he would catch himself in frustration with something that was going on from his former Catholic life and his new way of looking at Scripture and life. And he would say, "Mary, Mother of God," and this was just one of his expressions. And certainly we have in other languages like Sacre Bleu and Tabernaclin, and there just seem to be ways of capturing our frustration by using sacred terminology. So Luther had the idea of an Immaculate Mother taught to him, but he moved away from that and said, she was a woman who dirtied her hands. She was a woman who had to wash her feet at the end of the day. She was not pristine at the end of a day. She got down and got dirty, and she was a real human being. And he raised the question of this. But if I would go back to the teaching of the Immaculate Conception of Mary, theologically, one line of thinking that is not Jewish is that if you're going to give birth to a perfect divine being, you yourself have to be free of those things. And so whether it's Protestant or Catholic teachings on Mary, Mary has to be somebody more special than just an ordinary mother. And we actually have humor in Judaism about, I'm just filtering here to wonder if I can get away with some of the Jewish humor about Jesus. I will tell you 3 reasons why Jews believe that Jesus was Jewish. One is, like all Jewish fathers, Joseph was preparing his son to take over the family business. And like, let's see if I can remember all 3. I'm a little nervous here. So Jesus, like all Jewish boys, lived at home until he was 30 years old. And but most convincing is, like all Jewish mothers, Mary was convinced that her son was God. So we do find ways of dealing with the differences, even though it's none of our business to have anybody change their way. In order to have that virgin birth, then, there is an article by Jaffe in 2012 that considers all extant Talmudic material that references Jesus and identifies the context as a response to Christian teachings of the early 2nd century. So the article proposes a philological and historic analysis of the Talmud, and there is indeed much teaching about Jesus, although under pseudonyms, and it's not pretty teaching because it's really trying to keep try to keep Jews away from Christian influence and proselytizing and influences. So it gets to be quite polemic against Christianity, and particularly against the person of Jesus. With respect to the divinity of Jesus, and I'm very conscious of the time, the divinity of Jesus is not at all Jewish thought. In fact, the very first statement in Arya Kaplan's 2-volume work, a brilliant work on Jewish thought, is God is incorporeal. And that just basically takes care of it. God has no body. God can have no body. Anytime you read about the arm of God, the eye of God, the ear of God, those are all anthropomorphisms, and they stay that way. And as long as we can stay that way, we will not slip into having images of God, which is one of the commands back at Sinai. Don't have images of God, of things in heaven or in the skies, on earth, in the seas, under the earth. And then that prohibition is not just about carvings and art, which of course Jews continually break all the time by buying artwork and sculpts and everything, but it's also thought process, and particularly thought process. We're not to have images of God, and so we approach God apophatically. And by apophatically, it means by what God is not. And if we think of something and say, boy, is that like God? Then we're approaching like God, but not God. And so apophatically is okay. Cataphatically, having an image, you have seen me, you have seen the Father, is simply not Jewish in thought. And finally, or next to finally, the idea that Jesus says in the Eucharist or in the Passover Seder before he was crucified, "This is my body, take, eat it. This is my blood, take and drink it. My body and my blood." Jews are forbidden to eat human flesh. Jews are forbidden to drink any blood, not just human blood. And so just the idea alone is so contrary to Jewish thought, and therefore can't be something that Jewish tradition could ever support. And finally, Messiah. The word Messiah simply means anointed, and every prophet, priest, and king in the Hebrew Bible is an anointed being. You'd be interested to know that there is in the Talmud and there is in Midrash a Messiah, son of Joseph. But he's not good news for Jews. And then there's a Messiah, son of David. And he is good news for Jews. We don't know much about him, but he will come and he will deliver his people Israel. So even though the Messiah, son of Joseph, isn't intended to refer to Joseph, the father of Jesus, and even though Messiah, son of David, is not a visualized figure at this point, we do have these two concepts, and only the Messiah, son of David, is the one that has not come and is, by some Jews, expected and will be good news. And I am just being told by my clock that this is it. So the summary of Jesus, Jewish thought about Jesus can be aligned with the second station of the cross and the Via Dolorosa in Jerusalem, and that is Ecce Homo, behold the man. In 2001, forensic anthropologist Richard Neve created a model of a Galilean man for a BBC documentary, Son of God, working on the basis of an actual skull found in the region. He did not claim it was Jesus' face. It was simply meant to prompt people to consider Jesus as being a man of his time and place, since we're never really given a description about him. So we just finished looking at, we scratched the surface of just finished looking at Jewish thought, but all I wanted really to do was give us a taste of anybody who has an interest in communicating with Jews religiously and having some kind of expectation that maybe a non-Jewish way of looking at spirituality and at religion could be convincing, would need to factor in these and many other aspects, or they simply had such a strong view that their revelation of Jesus was so overwhelmingly correct and overwhelmingly convincing that it didn't matter what anybody else believed, and especially Jews. So it just makes me realize, and certainly I've thought about these things many times in the past, but it made me realize how little Luther knew about Jews and Judaism, how disinterested Luther was in knowing about Jews and Judaism. And no matter how we try and understand the early Luther portrait, it's impossible for us to, it's impossible for me, with the knowledge base I have, and having read every word of Luther, and also of my knowledge base of Jewish tradition, it's impossible for me to think that Luther was ever in his life a philo-Semite or a lover or a friend of Jews. He certainly, compared to those that were virulently and overtly anti-Semitic, out to get and out to harm Jews, he was a softer version. He was an anti-Semite light. But he could not be called non-anti-Judaic simply because he said in his very early years, if you try to attract with something sour, or if you try to attract with something poisonous, you're never going to attract. So my intention, and this is again transliteration, or a translation of Luther's own words, my approach is to be kind to the Jews, to be communicative or dialogical with the Jews, and hope that they will see reason and the revelation. However, if they don't, and this is what he adds, very early in his career, 1525, when he did the commentary on Romans, we will then have to see how we treat them. And so that's what we're going to look at next, because one of the expressions that he used over and over again throughout his service was this or that idea, this or that person, this or that situation is no better than a Turk or a Jew. And that is one of his expressions, just like the expression, Mary, Mother of God, It just repeats itself over and over again in his writings. Now, you'd have to collect, in maybe 10 volumes, you'd maybe get 16 quotes like that. But it's there, it's repeated, it's throughout his life and throughout his writings and teachings. So I would say that he had not an antithesis to, but a disregard for the anti-Semitism of his day. And he certainly never addressed it. For him, theology was the thing to address. And to correct the path, the interpretive path, the hermeneutic, if you would, the hermeneutical path or a biblical interpretive path of the Catholic Church, to move away from indulgences, many, many things that he sought to correct. But none of them had to do with correcting anti-Jewish and anti-Semitic thought or action. So we move to where Luther's quote-unquote contributions to anti-Semitism, and I realize that it's almost tongue-in-cheek that I use the word contribution, but certainly he did contribute. He didn't invent, but he did contribute, and he did augment, and he did raise the bar of anti-Semitism in his day and thereafter. So he wrote a tractate in 1543. Now, he died in 1543, so this is his last tractate. It was quite a healthy-sized tractate, and you see in the Roman numerals in that image, MDXLIII, or 111, and that is the Roman numeral for 1543, and it is the title is translated On the Jews and Their Lies. Now, what did he say in this 268, today the translation with critical notes and commentary is 268 pages in a more recent translation. First was, burn down Jewish synagogues and schools and warn people against them. I know, this is in your face. Number 2, refuse to let Jews own houses among Christians. So property ceased to be available for Jews, and properties were taken away. 3, take away Jewish religious writings. So we get the Talmud, we get the Jewish literature, the scrolls, all kinds of things taken into the center of cities and torched. We get these book-burning parties. Forbid rabbis from preaching. Offer no protection to Jews on the highways. And these were tough times. I mean, these were dangerous times to travel. Prohibit usury. Remove their silver and gold until they truly convert. Well, isn't that an opportunity for increasing your own treasure house? And finally, give young, strong Jews thrashing tools, axes, spades, and spindles, and make them earn their bread in the sweat of their brow. So these are the 7 principal directives that Luther's last publication provides for his view on the Jews and his suggested, recommended treatment of Jews. And of course, he didn't know that was going to be the year that he died. None of us do. But I would hope that in my life, I wouldn't come up with something like this just before I died. Whether there's a God or not, whether there's an afterlife or not, this is not how I'd like to be remembered. Well, 1543, the same year, Luther's influence on Protestant rulers was said to have contributed to the expulsion of Jews from the German region of Saxony in 1543. So we see Saxony here. And so basically, it worked. He had that strong an influence, not only on his theology and his teaching and that which initiated what we now look back on and say the Protestant Reformation that started a whole new tradition among Christianity, and a reliable tradition at that, as we've heard up until the past, and as Professor Joy is going to be presenting to us next week in the final session. However, moving along, there are, and I didn't know quite how to sublimate, how to encapsulate all of the effects and consequences. So I'm really skipping forward now because otherwise I'm just giving list after list after list of expulsion, of persecution on the charge of blood libel, of persecution and rounding up and putting people in buildings and burning the buildings and causing them to be burned to death, for host desecration, for all of the things we mentioned earlier. They're just set loose now. But in 1933 and 38, we move forward and we have this particular image of Martin Luther and the words, "Hitler's fight and Luther's teaching are the best defense for the German people." So really, he was owned by the German Third Reich, and certainly his On the Jews and Their Lies played a significant role in that, as well as other spurious writings that were elicited in the name of Martin Luther. It didn't matter whether they were apocryphal or not. There was just enough substance there for anything to be believed and everything to be taken advantage of. Mobs broke into synagogues, vandalizing their interiors, smashing everything they could find. The view of the old synagogue at Aachen after its destruction on Kristallnacht we see here. We see here. And this is courtesy of the Holocaust Memorial Museum in the United States. We have Martin Luther not simply making the statement of go get the Jews and giving permission at the highest level among Protestantism in its inception, but we have even in the last century the enduring consequences within the Lutheran Church as well as among Catholics and other Protestant denominations, to the point where we have to look at the culpability not just of the perpetrators, but the unfortunate culpability of bystanders. So I want to get to that. I just want to look at a couple more incidents or highlights, lowlights of the consequences. In January of 2005, some 20 members of the Russian State Duma publicly made a blood libel accusation against the Jewish people of Russia. They approached the Prosecutor General's office and demanded that Russia ban all Jewish organizations. They accused all Jewish groups of being extremist, anti-Christian, inhumane, and even accused them of practices that included ritual murders. So we're only looking at, was that 15 years ago? In the modern context of the world. Probably just as shocking, and I hope this, I've got a video set up, just a 2-minute video, but this is of a pastor of a Baptist church in Tempe, Arizona. I think it's the eastern section of Phoenix, Arizona. His name is Stephen Anderson, and he is part of an independent Baptist church congregation, a very vibrant church, and he has a podcast that has to do with story time with Uncle Steve. And I think it's quite telling to realize that not only is the virulence of anti-Semitism... So, I don't know how you respond to that, except to know that the garden still needs weeding. The dishes still need doing, the laundry still has to be done. And yet, one of the extremely positive turns that I would now like to finish with in the next 12 minutes is organizations such as the Brookline Institute in the Eastern Seaboard of the United States that has a branch called Facing History and Ourselves in Toronto. A study of the Holocaust as the most documented hatred, addressing genocide and bigotry, taking lessons learned in history and the full documentation that the Germans left to address responsibilities of victims who are psychologically and physically affected, perpetrators who are legally and socially culpable, and bystanders who have moral and ethical obligations. But then turning it into lessons so that we can look at how any people group, not Jews, any people group today is subjected to the same kind of bigotry and hatred and bias and racism. And we can learn from what the Holocaust has taught us and what pogroms and historical, I would hope, aberrations other than in targeting Jews can teach us, so that we can all make the world a better place and not have to watch the repetition of history. So in 1995, we're aware that Vatican II was a document that came from the Catholic Church, and the introduction that I read in this particular volume by Rush says, from the hell of the Shoah, or the Holocaust, came Christian self-reflection on centuries of Christian anti-Judaism and culpability that enabled the persecution of the Jews throughout the ages, culminating within the Holocaust, or with the Holocaust. The Catholic Church's 1965 document Nostra Aetate, which rejected the charges of deicide, bring us to a point that is the most widely cited of Christian documents in this new era of Christian-Jewish relations. But it's not the first, and it certainly isn't the only document that we have today. And so I want to give 3 quotes from Nostra Aetate and then move into Lutheran response. The Jews should not be presented as rejected or accursed by God. And of course, not only is this saying where we move on, but it's also telling to where it was for centuries. God holds the Jews most dear for the sake of their fathers, and of course that's citing Romans chapter 11, verses 27 to 29. The gospel's spiritual love decries hatred, persecutions, displays of anti-Semitism directed against Jews at any time and by anyone. So I need to be very selective here in how I look at Lutheran responses to Luther and anti-Semitism. So I just pick 5 moments. 4 moments are positive, and then I rewind back to 1983, where there still is a Lutheran subdenomination that is less than advanced in this regard. We have in 1984 statements from the International Jewish Committee on Interreligious Consultations and the Lutheran World Federation consultation in Stockholm the year prior, and then the documentation was published in 84, stating, among many other things, the sins of Luther's anti-Jewish remarks, the violence of his attacks on the Jews must be acknowledged with deep distress, and all occasions for similar sin in the present or the future must be removed from our churches. Lutherans of today refuse to be bound by all of Luther's utterances on the Jews. Not some, all. And then it continues by talking about, we Lutherans take our name and much of our understanding of Christianity from Martin Luther, but we cannot accept or condone the violent verbal attacks that the Reformer made against the Jews. Lutherans and Jews interpret the Hebrew Bible differently, but we believe that a Christological reading of the Scriptures does not lead to anti-Judaism, let alone anti-Semitism. And again, when engaging in Christian-Jewish dialogue today, the question must be asked, what has really been achieved in Christian-Jewish dialogue when anti-Semitism and an uncritical condemnation of the State of Israel tend to increase rather than decrease throughout Europe and worldwide? So the Lutheran World Federation has really made a point from 1984 on to keep this on the front burner. We acknowledge the importance of the land of Israel to the Jewish people and its central place in the promises of God. We therefore affirm that the connection of the Jewish people to the land is not a racist ideology, but a central element of the Jewish faith. And I would say that that was one of the differences that we saw between Christian theology and Jewish thought a number of slides back. And now, at least in word, and certainly in some expressions, there has been a coming together of perspective on acknowledging the right of the State of Israel to exist and not to interfere. It's a tough one because there's a lot of other stuff hitting the fan on that particular topic that Jews and Christians alike are not comfortable with. And finally, anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism are present in every church and society represented in this consultation. The expressions are many and the roots are several. We encourage member churches to raise their voices against anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism wherever they appear, and actively to support Jewish communities in maintaining their traditional observances. So, in contrast to the Lutheran World Federation's declaration, the Missouri Synod is a a denomination within the denomination, or a split off, they might see it the other way, of the Lutheran Church, the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America and Canada. And their statement takes us back to the supersessionism that was part and parcel of Luther's approach. While the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, this is them, holds Martin Luther in high esteem for his bold proclamation and clear articulation of the teaching of Scripture, it deeply regrets, I'll catch up here. It deeply regrets and deplores statements made by Luther which express a negative and hostile attitude toward the Jews. So far, so good. In light of the many positive and caring statements concerning the Jews made by Luther throughout his lifetime, I frankly haven't read them, maybe my German's that bad, it would not be fair on the basis of these few regrettable and uncharacteristic negative statements to characterize the reformer as a rabid anti-Semite. The Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, however, does not seek to excuse these statements of Luther, but denounces them without denouncing Luther's theology. By this statement, the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod retained its supersessionist position that Jews must be saved through faith in Christ, resolved that in that light we personally and individually adopt Luther's final attitude toward the Jewish people. So it's pretty tough to hear that and think that of all the marvelous work that's being done and has been done by the Lutheran World Federation, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada, and the local synods statements, it's really difficult to know that they're also Lutherans, a branch of Lutherans that are really haven't come a long way except in language. They say, we're better already, thanks, and we haven't changed our opinion of Luther's final statement. Now, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada's resolution in 1995 and the subsequent Eastern Synod statement that a person who may be in attendance here right now, Bill Hurus. Bill, could you please stand up? I want to acknowledge who was the Eastern Synod's bishop here in this Waterloo region, in the Eastern Synod. And Bill was the bishop at the time that the Synod of this area made the bold and irrefutable step to acknowledge that Luther was completely wrong and that there need to be correction in practice. So thank you very much, Bill. Really honor you in that, and it's an honor that you're here today for this particular presentation. Thank you. And Bill also, at the time, not only made the statement and changed history for this Eastern Synod, but he also had the current rabbi, the contemporary rabbi of Beth Jacob Synagogue, the Orthodox Synagogue, come and make a statement himself so that Jews could be heard in their own voice. That's so wonderful. So the statement that we read is, we hold an honest historical treatment of Luther's attacks on the Jews takes away from modern anti-Semites the assumption that they may legitimately call on the authority of Luther's name to bless their anti-Semitism. We insist that Luther does not support racial anti-Semitism, national anti-Semitism, or political anti-Semitism. And it just continues on in that wonderful vein. Now, the Evangelical Church of Germany, the Lutheran Church, the EKD, reiterated the point and in saying 50 years ago, at its second session in Berlin, the Synod of the Evangelical Church in Germany declared, we state clearly that through omission and silence, now I'm going to have to catch up here, through omission and silence, we too have become guilty before the merciful God of the outrage perpetrated against the Jews by members of our German people. And it just goes on. It's all available for you online, so I'll just continue on because I'm cognizant of the time. I would like to say that among these four very positive statements, there's a fifth one, and that's Martin Luther University College. And I don't say this because they're my paycheck. I say this because they invited me as Jewish scholar in residence and as professor of Hebrew Scriptures for the first time to develop a Jewish studies program, to actually have Judaism taught through Jewish perspective with Jewish voice. And the leadership, Mark Harris, and I made sure he wasn't here so I wouldn't embarrass him. Mark would have been here. He's in Toronto for a meeting. But Mark invited me to create the first of an annual series called Luther Legacy, in which the flaws as well as the contributions positively of Martin Luther would be addressed. And our first full-day conference began this year with Rabbi Joseph Telushkin, one of the most prolific and profound Jewish thinkers and scholars, to come and give a topic on Luther's anti-Semitism. And in closing, my initial presentation summary was how a flawed human legacy invites critical validation in a way that reinforces neither anti-Jewish animosity nor anti-Lutheran rhetoric. That was before I read the Missouri Synod statement, and that was before I also recognized through conversation with a number of Lutheran pastors that we're in every congregation. We're not completely there yet. And so the evidences, for me, are too strong to redeem Martin Luther from crimes against humanity. My initial presentation summary is flawed in that it permits a generous reading of Luther's virulent anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism, offering a way out for anyone today who would hold to his views or ascribe their culpability to him instead. However, I would give a revised statement simply saying, and genuinely heartfelt saying, how a flawed human legacy invites critical validation in a way that reinforces neither anti-Jewish animosity nor anti-Lutheran rhetoric, probably should be anti-Semitic rhetoric, when recognition, apology, and commitment to ongoing correction is irresolutely set in place by the Lutheran Church and its educational cognates. Thank you very much. Oh, nice.
Take them on as you see fit.
All right, I'm just going to take them on as I see fit, as my instructions. So I'm not going to read these in advance and vet them. I'm simply going to read the ones that I can read legibly, and then I'm going to pass on the ones that the handwriting is just like mine and nobody could read it. So the question, if Jewish thought was not traditionally literal, why was body and blood such a problem? Well, it wouldn't have been such a problem if Jews were simply invited to let Christians teach what they want and practice as they want without asking Jews, without demanding Jews come along on the ride. So it really wouldn't be a problem, because how it's read, it can be read transubstantially, consubstantially, memorially, and that's just fine with Jews because it's none of our business. But as soon as you say you must convert and be a Christian and then eat the body and drink the blood, whether it's memorial or consubstantial or transubstantial, that's where the problem lies. So I think I appreciate the question because it does beg a question. And the question that it begs is, would it be a problem if Jews were not obligated to convert? No, it wouldn't. And we would wish everyone well. Was the Messiah, son of Joseph, considered bad news? Well, certainly if he's referring to the Joseph and Mary, historically speaking, the name has been bad news because of all that's been done in the name of Jesus, son of Joseph. recognizing that there are New Testament gospel texts that refer to him as Son of David, that is not the portrait of the Son of David that is in Jewish literature. The Son of David portrait is one that comes as a victor for the Jewish people and subjugates all of the nations that do not acknowledge and honor Israel and the God of Israel. So the kind of anti-Semitism gets in the way of the Son of David being the image that Jews have of the Jesus of history. Did Martin Luther's views on Jews change as he aged and matured? Yes, they did. No, I don't know. It's a better answer. I don't know because he was always saying, right from the beginning, no better than a Turk or a Jew. So there's something already at work there. He also laid out the gauntlet saying, we're going to be nice to these people so that they will convert. That doesn't sound like friendship. That sounds like negotiation and with a power card. And then he even ended that sentence with, but if they won't convert, we'll just see what we have to do. And so I just don't know as that's generosity of spirit and kindness of heart. Okay, I'm playing with words here. Why, in your view, I like the in your view, because if there was another Jew up here, it would be an entirely different answer. Why, in your view, are Jews... picked on with anti-Semitism over the centuries? So Gary Larson of Farside Gallery fame has a picture of a small circle of deer down in a valley near a grove of trees, and the deer whose back is to us looking down that grove has a bullseye on his back, and one of the other deer says, "Bummer of a birthmark, Hal." Sometimes I wake up in the morning and think the name Israel ends with the name of God. Israel, struggle with God, is what Israel means. And El, the last part of Israel, is the name of God. And I think some days I wake up and I think there might be something going on between the world that doesn't like God and the name of God, wherever it's found. And so I sometimes might answer, maybe there's something spiritual going on there, where dark forces coincide and all part of eternity breaks loose against Jews. At other times, I think there's a trope. There are various stereotypical tropes that are scapegoat tropes that are easy to grab onto. The handle's there. If you're looking for a scapegoat, the handle's there, whether you're reading Shakespeare or what, no matter what you're reading, they're out there and they're being reinforced. You listen to Bach, they're there. And, you know, they say that warnings in the Soviet Union continue. They persist during Passover time, warnings to Christians, watch your children, because Passover is coming, with that blood libel in the background. But it's also true the other side of the mirror. There are warnings throughout the world in Jewish communities saying, Easter's coming. Watch out. You're going to be targeted and you don't even know why. Is it deicide? Did we kill God? Is it this or that? What is it? And I guess my academic answer, and I think that's why I'm here, I am wearing this other hat, but I'm trying to keep the academic hat in place. And I guess my academic answer is there is no reasonable response or understanding of a rational response to bigotry and racism, anti-Semitism, hatred. It goes beyond reason. But reasonable people need to stand firm and see it clearly. Anyway, my non-answer. I regard Christian faith as a subset of Judaism. Care to comment? Yes. Now? From Constantine on, when Sabbath was instituted as Sunday instead of Saturday. Now, I know that Christians were meeting on Sundays, the first day of the week rather than Sabbath, before that, but it became legislated. When Passover was replaced with Easter, and Uster was the fertility god in which chocolate was an aphrodisiac, rabbits were prolific in family life, and it was all about new life, a spring festival of fertility. And that is what Constantine decided to replace Passover with. Even though in Corinthian correspondence you read the Apostle Paul says, when you keep the feast, keep the leavened bread of sincerity and honesty and all these things. The presupposition is when you keep Passover. So we know that early in the church, Passover was still being kept. But there were these seminal points in early Christian history where Jewish things were being replaced with non-Jewish things intentionally. So in regarding Christian faith as a subset of Judaism, I would say that historically, I think that's exactly right. However, there were other reasons too. In the first Jewish revolt, when Akiva identified himself as the divine Messiah, go figure, he lost all of the followers of Jesus who were there shoulder to shoulder with the Jews fighting the Romans. And it decimated the battle forces against the Romans, and it ended up being a slaughter. Jews have remembered that time in which the Jewish followers of Jesus walked away on the battlefield. So it's very complicated. And I would say that there's plenty of evidence that Jesus should still be regarded as a Jew. My question back would be, when Jesus returns, from a Christian point of view, is he going to be Jewish? Do I have another minute? Another question? Sure. Okay. Do Lutherans believe? Oh, this is going to be a tough one because I'm not Lutheran. But do Lutherans believe in original sin? Immaculate Mary. When did the Roman Catholic Church state these things above? Okay, good. I don't know whether Lutherans, but I do have a couple of Lutheran scholars sitting right in front of me. So let me ask, just a quick, off the top of your head, Paul, do Lutherans believe in original sin? Yes. And Oz, Cole Arnell, and original blessing. Okay. So at least we got half of the question addressed by scholars who are Lutheran, and certainly I would never question their perspective on that. Okay, it says, name the negative about Luther clearly, and then it adds, just for me, s'il vous plaît. For me, the negative of Luther is that Luther did have an opportunity to address anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism from the very beginning. And that, to me, is the seed of the problem. He didn't. Just like we saw that person from Phoenix, Arizona, say, this is a great book about on the Jews and their lies. It's just this one theological point that makes me not even want to recommend this otherwise great book. And what Luther did was, he said, you know what, the most important thing here isn't how we treat people. It's what we think theologically. And to me, that is, what do they call that? The thin edge of the wedge. From then on, it's just expanding until it can only lead to its natural outworking. But that's just me. I have never thought that question before, so je ne sais pas. Or lo yodea in Be'ivrit in Hebrew. Thank you very much for your attention, and thank you very much for your kind engagement.
You have been listening to Martin Luther and Anti-Semitism, the 7th talk in an 8-lecture series titled Shifting Paradigms, Martin Luther's Enduring Global Impact. This lecture series was presented at Rim Park in Waterloo, Ontario, Canada, through January and February 2020 by Martin Luther University College and the Third Age Learning KW. Thank you for joining us. If you'd like more information about Third Age Learning KW and its upcoming lectures, visit the website tal-kw.ca. And for more information on Martin Luther University College and its programs, visit the school's website at luther.wlu.ca.